I don't suppose that many people have heard of Charles Auckland, the pathologist, as he isn't the type of man who catches the public eye. What slight reputation he has got is of rather a sinister nature, for he has always tended to avoid the broad, beaten tracks of scientific research, and has branched off to bring light into certain dark cul-de-sacs of the human mind, which many people feel should be left unilluminated. Not that one would suspect it from his appearance. Some men who spend their lives studying abnormalities begin to look distinctly queer themselves, but not Auckland. To look at him, one would put him down as a country doctor, a big red-faced man of about 60, obviously still pretty fit, with a shrewd but kindly face. We belonged to the same club and for years had been on nodding terms, but I didn't discover until quite recently that he was a book collector, and that only accidentally. I went to refer to Davenport's armorial bookbindings in the club library and found him reading it. He deplored its inaccuracies, and I offered to lend him a list of corrections and additions that I had been preparing. This led to further discussion on bindings, and finally he invited me to go back with him to his flat and see his books. It was not yet 10 o'clock, and I agreed readily. The night was fine, and we strolled together across the park to Artillery Mansions, where he was living at the time. On arriving, we went up in the lift, and were soon seated in the dining-room of his flat, the walls of which were lined with books from floor to ceiling. I was glad to see that one alcove was entirely filled with calf and vellum bindings, the sight of which sent a little thrill of expectation down my spine. I crossed the room to examine them, and my host rose too. A glance showed me that they were all of the class that second-hand booksellers classify comprehensively under the word occult. This, however, did not surprise me, as I knew of Auckland's interests. He took down several volumes and began to expatiate on them. Some first editions of the astrological works of Robert Flood, and a very fine copy of the 1575 Theatrum Diabolorum. I expressed my admiration, and we began to talk of trials for witchcraft. He had turned aside to fetch a copy of Scott's Discovery to illustrate some point in his argument. Suddenly my eye became riveted on the back of a small book on the top shelf, and my heart missed a beat. Of course it couldn't be, but it was fantastically like it. The same limp vellum cover without any lettering, with the same curious diagonal tear in the vellum at the top of the spine. My hand shook a little as I took it down and opened it. Yes, it was the book. I read once more the title villainously printed on indifferent paper. Herodes Redivivus si liber sclerosae vitae et mortis sanguinolentae redsii, monstri nanatensis, Parisiis M.D. ex L.V. As I read the words, memories came flooding back of that macabre episode which had overshadowed my school days. Some of the terror that had come to me 20 years before returned, and I felt quite faint. "I say, you must have a nose for a rarity," said Auckland, pointing to the volume in my hand. "I've seen this book before," I replied. "Really?" he said. "I'd be very glad to know where. There's no copy in any public collection in England, and the only one I've traced on the continent is in the Ambrosian Library at Milan. I haven't even seen that. It is in the catalogue, but it's one of those books that librarians are very reluctant to produce. Can you remember where you've met it before?" "I mean that I've seen this copy before," I answered. He shook his head dubiously. "I think you must be mistaken about that. I've owned this for nearly 20 years, and before that it was the property of a man that you're most unlikely to have met. In fact, he died in Broadmoor 15 years ago. His name was—" "Race," I interposed. He looked at me with interest. "I shouldn't have expected you to remember that," he said. You must have been at school during the trial. Not that it got much publicity. Thank God there's legislation to prevent the gutter press from splashing that sort of stuff across their headlines. He half smiled. You must have been a very precocious child. Surely you were only a schoolboy at the time. Yes, I replied. I was a schoolboy. The schoolboy, one might say. The one who gave evidence at the trial and whose name was suppressed. He put down the book he was holding and looked hard at me. That's most extraordinarily interesting. I suppose you wouldn't be willing to tell me about it. As you know, cases of that sort are rather my subject. Of course, it would be in the strictest confidence. I smiled. There's nothing in my story that I'm particularly ashamed of, I replied, though I must confess that I occasionally feel that if I'd been a little more intelligent, the tragedy might have been averted. However, I've no objection at all. It's only of academic interest now. I haven't thought about the matter for years. He sat me down in an armchair and poured me out a large whisky and soda, then settled himself opposite me. Take your time about it, he said. I'm a very late bird, and it's only 11:15. I took a long drink and collected my thoughts. I was at a large school on the outskirts of Bristol, I began, and was not quite 16 at the time of these events. Even in those days I was extremely interested in old books, a hobby in which I was encouraged by my housemaster. I never cut a great figure on the games field, and when it was wet or I was not put down for a game, I used to go book hunting in Bristol. Of course my purse was very limited and my ignorance profound, but I got enormous pleasure out of pottering round the shops and stalls of the town, returning every now and then with a copy of Pope's Homer or Theobald's Shakespeare to grace my study. I don't know whether you're acquainted with Bristol, but it's a most fascinating town. As one descends the hills towards the Avon, one passes from the Georgian crescents and squares of Clifton into the older maritime town, with its magnificent churches and extensive docks. Down by the river are many narrow courts and alleys which are unchanged since the days when Bristol was a thriving medieval port. Much of this poorer era was out of bounds to the boys at school, but having exhausted the bookshops of the university area, I found it convenient to ignore this rule, and explored every corner of the old town. One Saturday afternoon, in the summer term, I was wandering around the area between St. Mary Redcliffe and the old floating harbour, and I discovered a little court approached through a narrow passage. It was a miserable enough place, dark and damp, but a joy to the antiquarian, so long as he didn't have to live there. The first floors of the half-timbered houses jutted out and very nearly shut out the sky, and the court ended abruptly in a high blank wall. At the end, on the right, was a shop. At least the ground-floor window was filled with a collection of books. They were of little interest, and from the accumulation of dust upon them, it was obvious that they hadn't been disturbed for years. The place had a deserted air, and it was in no great hope of finding it open that I tried the door. But it did open, and I found myself in its dark interior. Books were everywhere. All the shelves were blocked by great stacks of books on the floor, with narrow lanes through which one could barely squeeze sideways, and over everything lay the same thick coating of dust that I'd noticed in the window. I felt as though I were the first person to enter it for years. No bell rang as I opened the door, and I looked round for the proprietor. I saw him sitting in an alcove at my right, and I picked my way through the piles of books to his desk. Did you ever see him yourself? Only later in Broadmoor, replied Auckland. I'd like you to describe in your own words exactly how he struck you at the time. Well, I resumed, my first impression of him was the extreme whiteness of his face. One felt on looking at him that he never went out into the sun. He had the unhealthy look that a plant gets if you leave a flower-pot over it and keep the light and air from it. His hair was rather long and straight, and a dirty grey. Another thing that impressed me was the smoothness of his skin. You know how sometimes a man looks as though he has never had any need to shave. Attractive in a young man, but quite repulsive in an old one. Well, that's how he looked. He stood up as I approached, and I saw he was a fat man, not grotesquely so, but sufficiently to suggest grossness. His lips particularly were full and fleshy. I was half afraid of my own temerity in having entered, but he seemed glad to see me, and said in rather a high-pitched voice, "Come in, my dear boy. This is a most pleasant surprise. What can I do for you?" I mumbled something about being interested in old books and wanting to look round, and he readily assented. Shambling round from pile to pile, he set himself deliberately to interest me, and the man was a fascinating talker. In a very little while he had summed up my small stock of bibliographical knowledge, and was enlightening me on dates, editions, issues, values, and other points of interest. It was with real regret that I glanced at my watch and found that I had to hurry back to school. I had made no purchase, but he insisted on presenting me with a book, a nicely bound copy of Sterne's Sentimental Journey, and made me a promise to visit him again as soon as I could. "Have you still got the Sterne?" asked Auckland. "No," I said. "My father destroyed it at the time of the trial." As the shop was in a part of the town that was strictly out of bounds, I didn't mention my visit to my housemaster. But on the following Thursday it was too wet for cricket, and I returned to my newly found friend. This time he took me up to a room on the first floor, where there were more books and several portfolios of prints. Race, for such I discovered was his name, was a mine of information on the political history of the 18th century, and kept me enthralled by his exposition of a great volume of Gilray cartoons. The man had a sort of magnetism, and at that impressionable age I fell completely under his spell. He drew me out about myself and my work at school, and it was impossible for a boy not to feel flattered by the attention of so learned a man. It was easy to forget his rather repellent physical qualities when he talked so brilliantly. Suddenly we heard the shop door below opening, and with an exclamation of annoyance he descended the stairs to attend to the customer. A minute or two passed, and he did not return. I listened and could hear the murmur of conversation below. I idly pulled a book or two from the shelves and glanced at them, but there was little in the room that he had not already shown me. I went to the door and peered down over the stairs, but couldn't see what was going on. My ears caught a scrap of dialogue about the county histories of Somerset. I became bored. Across the landing at the top of the stairs was another room, the door of which was very slightly ajar. I'm afraid that I'm of a very inquisitive disposition. I pushed it open and peeped in. It was obviously where Race lived. There was a bed in one corner, a wardrobe, and a circular table in the middle of the room. But what caught my eye at once and held me spellbound was a picture over the fireplace. No words of mine can describe it. Auckland nodded. I saw it. An unrecorded Goya, in his most blood-curdling vein, made his witch's Sabbath look like a school treat. It was burned by our unimaginative police force. They wouldn't even let me photograph it. He sighed. I resumed. I went nearer to have a look at it. On the mantelpiece below it was a book, the book you've got now on your top shelf. I opened it and read the title page. Of course it meant nothing to me. Gilles de Rais doesn't figure in the average school curriculum. Suddenly I heard a noise behind me and swung round. There was Race standing in the doorway. He had come up the stairs without my hearing him. I shall never forget the blazing fury in his eyes. His face seemed whiter than ever as he stood there, a terrifying figure literally shaking with rage. I quickly tried to make my apologies, but he silenced me with a gesture. Then he snatched the book from my hands and replaced it on the mantelpiece. Still without speaking, he pointed to the door, and I went quickly down the stairs. He followed me down into the shop. I was about to leave without another word when suddenly his whole manner changed. It was as though he had recollected some powerful reason for conciliating me. He laid a hand on my arm. "My dear boy," he said, "you must forgive my momentary annoyance. I am a methodical man, and I can't bear people touching the things in my room. I'm afraid that living as something of a recluse has made me rather fussy. I quite realize that you meant no harm. There are some very valuable books and pictures in there. Not for sale, but my own private collection, and naturally I can't allow customers to wander in and out of it in my absence." I expressed my contrition awkwardly enough, for the whole situation had embarrassed me horribly, and I felt ill at ease. He perceived this and added, "Now you mustn't worry about this, and least of all must you let it stop you coming here. I want you to promise that you'll visit me as soon as you can again, just to show that you bear no ill will. I'll hunt out some interesting things for you to look at." I gave him my promise and hurried back to school. In a day or two I had persuaded myself that I'd been imagining things, that some trick of the light had made him appear so distorted with rage. After all, why should a man get so angry about so little? As for the picture, it made comparatively little impression on my schoolboy mind. Much that it depicted was unintelligible to me at the time. I was in any case unlikely to invite it into the private room again, and so I resolved to pay a further visit to the shop. An opportunity didn't occur for nearly a fortnight, and when I did manage to slip down to Bristol, there was no mistaking how glad he was to see me. He was almost gushing in his manner. He had been as good as his word in finding more books to show me, and I spent a most pleasant afternoon. Race was as voluble as ever, but I got the impression that he was slightly distrait, as though he were labouring under some sort of suppressed excitement. Several times as I looked up from a book I caught him looking at me in a queer reflective way, which made me feel a little uncomfortable. When I finally said that I must go, he made a suggestion that he had never made before. "You've got very dusty," he said. "You really must wash your hands before you go. There's a basin downstairs. I'll turn on the light for you." As he said this, he stepped across the shop, opened a door and turned a switch, illuminating a long flight of stairs. I descended them. They were of stone and led apparently into a cellar. As I reached the bottom step, the light was extinguished. I turned sharply and saw him standing at the head of the stairs, a fantastic, foreshortened figure at the top of the shaft, silhouetted in the doorway. He had his hands stretched out, holding on to the jambs of the door, and with the half-light of the shop behind him, he looked like a misshapen travesty of a cross. I called out to him and started to remount the stairs, but as I did so, he quickly closed the door without saying a word. I was terribly afraid. Of course it might have been a joke, but I knew inside me that it wasn't and that I was in the most deadly peril. I reached the top of the stairs and groped at the door, but there seemed to be no handle inside. I couldn't find the switch either. It must have been in the shop. I shouted. There was no reply. An awful horror gripped me. The dank smell of the stone cellar, the lack of air and the darkness all conspired to undermine what little courage I possessed. I shouted again, then listened, holding my breath. All at once I heard the outer shop door open and an unfamiliar footstep inside the shop. With all my strength I pounded on the door, shouting and screaming like a madman. The noise reverberating round the confined space nearly deafened me. I listened again for a second. Voices were raised in the shop, but I caught no words. I shouted again until I felt my lungs would burst, and hammered on the door until my fists were bruised. Suddenly it was flung open, and I stumbled out, hysterical with fear and half-blinded by the daylight. Before me stood an old clergyman. Behind him, Race, who bore on his face the same look of malevolent fury that I had seen before. "What is the matter?" asked the clergyman. "How did you get shut in there?" It was then that I made my fatal mistake. All I wanted was to get away and never come back again. If I lodged a complaint, I foresaw endless trouble, with the school authorities, even with the police. My terror had evaporated with the daylight, and I was feeling more than a little ashamed of myself. "I went down to wash my hands," I said. "The lights went out and I got frightened. I'm quite all right now, though." The clergyman looked inquiringly at Race, but the latter had recovered his self-possession. "The lights must have fused," he said. "They often do. It's the damp. I was just going to let him out when you came in. No wonder he was frightened. It's a most eerie place in the dark." The clergyman looked from him to me, as if inviting some comment from me, but I merely said, "I ought to be getting back to school now." We left the shop together, and as we walked through the passage out of the court I looked back, and there was Race standing on the step of his shop, following us with baleful eyes. My companion seemed to be debating whether he would ask me a question, but he refrained. I hardly liked to ask him to say nothing about the episode. He obviously wished to satisfy his curiosity. But we were complete strangers, and, though old enough to be my grandfather, he seemed to be a diffident man. It was a curious relationship. He put me on to a bus, and I thanked him gravely. As we shook hands, he said abruptly, "I shouldn't go there again," and turned away. For a few days I was on tenterhooks lest he should make any report of the occurrence to the school, but as the days became weeks and I heard no more, my mind became at rest. I had firmly decided that nothing would induce me to visit Race's shop again, and soon the whole episode assumed an air of unreality in my mind. I looked at my watch. "Good Lord," I said to Auckland, "it's getting pretty late. Do you want to go to bed? We could have another session tomorrow." "Certainly not," he replied. "I find your story of the most absorbing interest. It fills in all sorts of gaps in my knowledge of the affair. If you don't mind sitting up, I should greatly appreciate it if you'd carry on." He refilled my glass, and I settled myself more comfortably into my chair. "Well," I continued, "I'm a bit diffident about telling the rest of the story. Up to now it's been pretty strange, but it has been sober fact. Now we get into realms where I find myself a bit out of my depth." Auckland nodded. "Never mind," he said. "Let's have it, just as it comes back to you. Don't try to explain it, just tell me what happened." "A year passed and I was still at school," I continued. "I'd got into the sixth form and was working pretty hard for a scholarship. I'd also got into the house cricket 11 by some miracle, and so I couldn't be so free and easy about games as I had been previously. Public opinion forced me to take them fairly seriously. A dropped catch at a critical point in a match can make a schoolboy's life pretty good hell. At that age I used to sleep extraordinarily well. I still do, for that matter. It was very rare for me to dream, and then only of trivial affairs. But on the night of June the 26th, I noted the date in my diary, I had the first of a couple of particularly horrible dreams. I dreamed most vividly that I was back in Race's shop. Every detail of that untidy interior passed in an accurate picture through my brain. I was standing in the middle of the shop, and it was dusk. Very little light came through those dusty windows piled high with books. Race himself was nowhere to be seen. The door to the cellar, which had such sinister associations for me, was closed. Suddenly, from the other side of it came a series of appalling and shouts, intermingled with muffled bangs and thumps on the door. I ran across and tried to open it, but it was locked. Then I darted out to the shop steps to see if anyone were at hand to assist me, but the court was deserted. I stood irresolute in the shop, and then all at once the cries seemed to get weaker, and the banging on the door ceased. I listened and could hear the sounds of a struggle on the stairs, gradually getting fainter as it reached the cellar below. At this point I awoke shivering with fright, bathed in a cold sweat. Sleep was impossible for me during the rest of the night. I lay and thought about my dream. It seemed so queer that I should dream, not of my own experience on the stairs, but from the point of view of an observer. The next night exactly the same thing occurred, and the horror of that scene so impressed me that I must have cried out in my sleep, for I found that I'd awakened several of the other boys in my dormitory. I couldn't bear the anticipation of having such a dream a third time, and I went to the house-matron on the following day and told her that I couldn't sleep. She moved me from the dormitory into the sick room and gave me a sedative. On that night and thereafter I slept quite normally again. Not quite a fortnight later a further link was forged in this extraordinary chain of events. I was passing the local police station, and I stopped to read a notice posted outside about the protection of wild birds. I've always been a bit of an ornithologist. Along the railings in front of the building were hung the usual medley of notices: lost, found, and missing. My eye caught one more recent than the others, and I idly read it. I cannot, of course, remember the exact wording at this date, but it asked for information about a boy named Roger Wayland, aged 15 and a half. He was described in detail, and I remember being struck at once by his similarity to myself. He had left his home at Clevedon after lunch on June the 26th to bicycle into Bristol, where he intended to visit the docks. He was last seen near St. Mary Redcliffe at about 5:30 the same afternoon, and the police were asking anyone to come forward who could throw light on his whereabouts. I read and reread the notice. Its implication dawned on me at once. It's no good asking why, but I assure you that at the moment I knew what had happened. My dream of the night of June the 26th was still fresh in my memory, and even in the broad sunlit street I shuddered, and was oppressed by a feeling of nameless horror. I debated what I should do. The police, I felt sure, would laugh at me. I could never bring myself to walk into the station and blurt out such a fantastic tale to some grinning sergeant. But I must tell someone, and after dinner that day I sought an interview with my housemaster. He was a most understanding man, and listened in patient silence while I told him the whole story. I must have spoken with conviction, because at the end of it he rang up a friend of his, a local inspector of police. Half an hour later I repeated my tale to him. He was very polite, asked one or two searching questions, but I could see that he was sceptical. He did, however, agree with my housemaster that Race's activities might profitably be looked into. If you followed the trial, I suppose you know all the rest. How they found the boy's body, God knows what other devilish things beside. My name was suppressed in the evidence, and I left school at the end of that term and went abroad for 6 months. One very odd thing about it all was that they never traced the clergyman. The police were most anxious to get him to corroborate my story, and my father was equally keen to find him. After all, he saved my life, and my father wanted to show some tangible appreciation of the fact, subscribe generously to one of his favourite charities or something. It's very queer, really, that the police, with all their nationwide organisation, never got on to him. After all, there aren't a limitless number of clergymen, and the number of those in the Bristol area that afternoon must have been comparatively small. Perhaps he didn't like to come forward and be connected with such a business, but I don't think that's very likely. He didn't strike me as the sort of man who would shirk his obligations. That's really all that I can tell you, and I expect you knew some of that already." "A certain amount," replied Auckland, "but by no means all. I occasionally get asked questions by the police in this kind of case, and I did assist them on this occasion, though I wasn't called in evidence. Race had a damned good counsel in Rutherford, and managed to convince the jury that he was insane. If a man is sufficiently wicked, a British jury will often believe that he must be mad, and so he went to Broadmoor. Of course, he was as sane as you and I are." "How did you come to get hold of one of his books?" "Through the good offices of the police," he said, "perhaps as a sort of consolation prize for my distress at the destruction of the Goya. The book is really the clue to race. It is a contemporary account of the activities of Gilles de Rais, Marshal of France, hanged at Nantes in 1440. I expect you know a certain amount about him. He figures in all the standard works on diabolism. The contemporary authorities are a bit vague on the exact number of children he murdered. Monstrelet says 160, but Chastelin and some others put it at 140. But all this is general knowledge. What isn't so widely known is that every now and then he seems to reappear in history. At least the devilish practices with which his name is associated crop up again and again. He was quite a cult in 17th-century Venice, and there was a case in Bohemia in the middle of the last century. A variant of de Rais's name is de Race, and Race himself claimed to be a descendant, but I've no proof of this. The police failed to trace his parentage or to find any details about him before he appeared in Bristol, just before the First World War. His shop is gone now. The whole of that area was pulled down in a recent slum clearance scheme. The trial at Nantes in 1440 has always been an interest of mine, and I had a great find the last time I was in Paris. Some early Nantes archives had recently been acquired by the Bibliothèque Nationale, and I spent a happy week examining all the original documents relating to the examination of the woman, La Meffrey, who procured most of the children for de Rais. I've got transcripts of the most important. Would you care to borrow them? They're quite enthralling." "Not on your life," I replied as I rose to take my leave. I came far too near to playing the principal role to read about such things with any pleasure. You may be able to take a detached scientific view of the case, but believe me, I've had enough of de Rais and all his works to last me a lifetime.